All right, here we go. All righty. So, welcome to Talk Tuesday, everyone. Talk Tuesday is a virtual series of workshop conversations that provides a forum that amplifies the voices of marginalized and/or underrepresented communities around various topics centered around intersectionality and social justice. The series plans to serve as a catalyst to promote, celebrate, and increase cultural awareness at Georgia State University, encourage cross-cultural dialogue and engagement, and advance global and intercultural fluency and cultural competency. Each workshop is uniquely designed and expertly facilitated to create a safe environment for authentic conversation, varying viewpoints, and cultural exchange. Selected guest speakers help to shift personal paradigms and facilitate learning and understanding through their scholarship, service, and storytelling. The topics and speakers presented do not represent the views of the Multicultural Center or Georgia State University, but are intended to reflect contemporary social concerns. All are welcome to take part in these cultural conversations. Today, we are joined in collaboration with TRIO, a student support service here at Georgia State University. I am your host, William Brito, and on this Talk Tuesday, we're going to be all right. An open dialogue about race, restorative justice, and how we heal despite difference is in recognition of the fifth anniversary of National Day of Racial Healing. Our moderator and panelists will discuss diversity in the United States and how we heal despite difference to move towards MLK's ideal of beloved community. Our panelists include Stephanie Cho, Executive Director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta, Dr. Andrew Cohen, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgia State University, Cameron Friend, Youth and Millennial Engagement Coordinator from the King Center, Alva Villarreal, Honors Student at Georgia State University, and Devin Barrington Ward, the Managing Director of the Black Futurist Group. All right, to give you some context, the expression beloved community was coined by American philosopher theologian Josiah Royce, who founded the Fellowship of Reconciliation, but popularized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who gave it a deeper meaning. Dr. King's beloved community possesses a global vision in which poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of military power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. Recently, Dr. Bernice King, daughter of the late Coretta Scott King and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and CEO of the King Center, said, "As the world has been gripped from the pandemic crisis of the coronavirus, we also find ourselves grappling with the harvest from the inhumane seeds of slavery. While the pandemic heightened our awareness of the health disparities in marginalized and disenfranchised communities, the 8 minute and 46 seconds murder of George Floyd by those sworn to protect revealed a reality America has so long ignored. However, the convergence of consciousness has revealed the urgency for all Americans to search themselves, their values, and their humanity to address the inequities that can no longer be ignored. So, our goal today is to reflect on our experiences, have real, open, and honest dialogue about the issues, and collectively reimagine beloved community. So, to begin this discussion, I would like to share a quote from Bell Hooks, a Black feminist author who writes in her book, Killing Rage, Ending Racism. Beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world. Let's start by each of you introducing yourselves and sharing a little bit about your identity and culture and how that has shaped your lived experience. So I would like to start with Stephanie, and then we will popcorn from there.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Stephanie Cho. I was born in Pyeongtaek, South Korea, and I came to the US when I was very young. And I grew up in Salem, Oregon, and then I saw a lot of different issues growing up in that area. And as a person, I just sort of grew up to really look at sort of difference and my difference and the way that people perceive me and the racism that I experienced there, it really propelled me to do things that were hard, I guess. And I think sometimes people now are averse to doing things that are hard because it's obviously it's easier to do things that you want to put off. But I guess the point is that the hard thing never goes away, and that issue is still there. For me, that issue is always white supremacy. White supremacy is always there. You know, even though there have been times when I think people viewed it as a more dormant time, it is obviously not right now. And so I think when I'm looking at issues of civil rights, particularly in Georgia and particularly in the South, it's always so important to think about, or at least for me to think about, like my place in that, my own historical history, the histories of fighters that came before me in South Korea, that history and legacy, and then also the ways that I want to show up and be accountable now. And I think that's the other thing that I see a lot in terms of sort of moving forward or thinking about, sort of like any kind of like coming together is there has to be that acknowledgement of number one, wrongdoing, number two, being able to really authentically apologize and say that you're sorry. And it's the fundamental things that I teach my kid. It's like be accountable if you do something wrong, right? And if you see things that are wrong in the world, then you have to speak up too. And I think it's just this basic stuff that I feel like it's like a loss of that of that deep accountability to each other that's happening, and it's a hard time. At the same time, there have been incredible victories that have happened in Georgia with women of color leading that, with the election that we just had, right? So I've been on this really long election sort of journey, but I think that the lessons learned from that are really about, you know, like just keep going and you're going to lose a ton. I mean, we're just used to losing for so many years. And so I think it's just this moment where there are some incredible gains that are happening, but there's some eclipsing. White supremacy is still eclipsing some of those beautiful gains that have happened from people in community organizing work in the South that was leading that work. And so it's just to be able to honor and uplift that more and more, like every day. I just think it's important to see that beauty and not forget it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We're going to move on to Alva.
All right. So hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Alva. I come from a Mexican background. So my parents are Mexican. I was born in California. Then I moved here to Georgia when I was 4 or 5. I turned 5 here, yeah. And my journey through through living these living in Georgia these past few years have been really and my journey fighting and advocating through against white supremacy, like Stephanie said, has been really like a journey, because a lot of the times you have to unpack things that you are just given all the time. And I think that my journey really, as any child of immigrants will tell you, it's like the journey's pushed up on us. And we're kind of introduced here and have to navigate it ourselves and kind of have to see like, oh, the differences between what we experience in our home life and the differences in outside of our home life. And I really enjoy right now just being an advocate for my community. And that includes mentoring, doing the work, canvassing, whatever that means to other people might be different, but for me, a lot of political advocacy and the fight against white supremacy is first community healing and community just participation. It all starts within the community, and that's something that I will always emphasize personally because of my experiences and because where I live. And I live in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Just a little background, I'll say stuff like where I come from, where I live, where I grew up, Stone Mountain, Georgia, since the beginning. So that just kind of gives me a quick little background. I don't want to take too much of the time.
Thank you, Alba. Next, we'll move to Mr. Devin Barrington Ward.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Bill, for having me a part of this very important discussion right after MLK Day. I have the privilege of being one of Will's close friends. Everybody else on the panel doesn't have that privilege, sorry. But he is an incredible leader, and I'm so glad that he is at Georgia State helping facilitate these important conversations. My name is Devin Barrington Ward. I come from an immigrant family as well. My mother's side of the family is from Jamaica. My father's side of the family is from Trinidad. And I believe that the work that I do daily at the Black Futurist Group, which is building Black futures, is inspired by the legacy of freedom fighting that is in my personal family. I actually have a photo. This is my great-great-great-grandfather, Paul Bogle. He's one of Jamaica's national heroes. He led a rebellion against the British government in, I want to say 1865. I may have my years mixed up. But led a rebellion that led to a lot of people being killed, a lot of Black people being killed. But it was because he had the rights to vote. He had land rights. He was not born as a slave, but his parents were, because slavery had ended in Jamaica a little bit before it did in the United States. But sacrificed his life, him and his brother, Moses Bogle, sacrificed his life in exchange for a future for Jamaica, where more self-determination for Black people on the island. I believe that it is not ironic that he burned down a courthouse and freed people from a jail. And a lot of the work that the Black Futurist Group does is prison abolitionist work, dismantling the mass incarceral system, the system of prisons and jails that lock away our greatest asset, which is our people. I am inspired by my family history, but the history of freedom fighting here in the city of Atlanta as well. The Black Futurist Group has been a part of the campaign to close the Atlanta City Detention Center, which is an ongoing campaign which holds people on low-level municipal violations. We are also working to reimagine public safety through pushing ordinances like the Rayshard Brooks bill, which would have reimagined what the Atlanta City Police Department looked like. And we also do a lot of public health work. And we do this work because the future for Black people is so important, because if there's no future for Black people, there's no future for anyone. The fact of the matter is that everyone's oppression derives from the original oppression of Black people being brought over here against our will, and the oppression experienced by Native people whose land were stolen. And so we are constantly doing the work to undo all of that. I too grew up in Stone Mountain, so shout out to Stone Mountain. I went to Stevenson High School. And I think it's really important to note that today we have a monument to white supremacy that exists in one of the most multicultural communities in Georgia. I grew up in a community that literally was overlooked by a mountain with Confederate soldiers. But I saw Black people who were homeowners for the first time, and I saw immigrant families who were establishing roots. And so all of those things inform how I show up to the work. I show up to the work as my full self, as a Black queer man, as an activist, as an organizer, as a futurist, and as someone that's committed to the future of the city of Atlanta and beyond. So thank you, Will, and thank you to all the other panelists. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Devin. All right, next we'll move on to Dr. Andrew Cohen.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, all. And I'm really glad to be part of the conversation And I want to thank the Multicultural Center and Trio, and especially William, for making this conversation possible. So we're starting off with this question about our cultural embeddedness and how that affects our outlook. And I guess I should say I don't have a single culture. I'm a member of many cultures, many subcultures, and many significant relationships. And some of these overlap. I'm an American. I'm a native New Yorker. I'm a non-practicing Jew. I'm a philosopher. I'm an educator. I'm a resident of a rural area south of Athens. And most important to me, I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a son, and I am a brother, and so on. And as we've already heard from Alba and Stephanie and Devin, this is true for each of us. We've all got these really significant ties, and we take them very seriously. We're embedded in these different communities. We identify, or we can be identified with certain groups and certain relationships. And in each case, we draw on these. So in my own case, I recognize how historic injustice, often in and around groups, inflects just so much of our history and our self-understandings. I also see group ties as really, really valuable resources, but they can also sometimes be potential obstacles. So ultimately, I hope that people can find some way to grow in their many worlds and their many relationships, and they'll be mindful of the legacies and the lessons and the burdens of what precedes us. So I look forward to the conversation. And by the way, Devin, that picture is way cool. That is such an amazing asset that you've got in your history. I find that fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. And last, but certainly not least, we have a representative from the King Center. We have Cameron Friend.
Absolutely. Well, William, thank you with me as I had some technical difficulties getting on. And I just want to make sure that I'm answering the right question. Which question are we answering right now? I'm sorry.
Absolutely. So as of right now, we're just giving a little bit about ourselves and your identity and culture and how that has shaped your lived experience.
Thank you, William. Yeah, so I'm originally from Denver, Colorado, and I know a lot of folks don't really think that Colorado or Denver has a large African American population, but most of us live in the city. There were a lot of things that affected my life, my engagement with police officers, my engagement with friends that a lot of us grew up in an inner city community where we didn't have the access to a lot of the best education, a lot of the best opportunities politically, business. The only reason that I made it out as I did is because I became an athlete. So my life was defined by the fact that I was a good athlete, but a lot of the infrastructure challenges that you have in inner cities for Black communities, for communities of color at large, we faced. And so there were several things that happened to me as a young man that in terms of my skin, my size being vilified, being criminalized as I grew up and as I began to expand myself politically and obviously going to school, attending the University of Northern Colorado, getting degrees in political science and philosophy. You learn a lot about what's happening in the world and how the world is engaging with us, and particularly with Black men and with Black women. So in terms of how my culture has shaped where I am and how I understand the work, again, as somebody who's very aware of American history, the past 402 years now of slavery that we've had and the transatlantic slave movement, the way that our cities and the way that our states have been governed and how our societies have been shaped because of what you have all talked about with how white supremacy has interacted in every part of our lives. Everything that we are has been defined by the state in many ways as something that doesn't belong, that doesn't fit. And so as we are trying to reconcile with who we are supposed to be, with the world we are supposed to live in, we have to continue to fight against these ideals of supremacy, of racism, of intolerance. We have to continue to find ourselves in spaces where we bring just as much to the world as anyone else, and everyone should have access to building that community together. So, yeah, I think it would be short to say that my entire life has been defined by culture, representing what the best parts of culture are, the things that are to be acknowledged and celebrated. At the same time, learning how to live out your culture, live out your experiences in ways that are valuable without them being tainted by how someone else sees you and understands you and engages with you. So I salute every single person on this panel. I know that we all have different journeys to getting here, but for me, that's how the journey began.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, panelists, for that beautiful introduction. Cameron, I'm going to throw the first question starting back at you, okay? So here's our first question, panelists. According to Dr. Bernice King, we cannot unify around injustice and lies in an authentic quest for healing and peace. Healing requires honesty. Peace requires justice. What does racial healing look like for you?
Well, I think it's interesting. We live in a country that has refused to be honest about its past, refused to be honest about its present, and refuses to be honest about where we are headed as we continue down this path. In order to have healing, you have to presuppose that someone has apologized, has acknowledged the wrongs of the past, the sins of the past. I think for a lot of us, we have relationships with friends and family members. And so, if you were to wrong someone, if someone was to wrong you, but then they asked for healing, but there was no point of repentance. There was no point where you offered restoration for what was done to hurt or harm, then, it's very difficult to have healing. So in large part, the conversation around racial healing has largely been by the group who has been the oppressor, asking for union, asking for unity, asking for healing without dealing with the fact that, again, for hundreds of years, communities have been marginalized. For hundreds of years, indigenous people have had their rights taken from them, their land taken from them. For hundreds of years, Black people, our bodies were used for a form of service where we were enslaved. We were brought over in chains, and we still have been enslaved in this country in many ways. We are economically behind. We are systemically behind in academics. We are behind in every measure possible, but yet we are supposed to have healing. So in order to understand what healing, in order to understand what peace is, you have to have justice. And justice, again, justice is not something that is standoffish. It's not something that's accidental. Justice has to be done on purpose. Widespread justice must be attained. And I think that when we're talking about justice, there's no way to have justice without having what reparations are. Again, reparations is a repairing of what was taken or what was lost. So, if there's been no repentance, if there's been no restoration, there's been no reparations, then it's hard to have actual healing in this world. So in terms of what racial healing would look like, you would have healing if you do what needs to be done, acknowledging the past that we have all experienced and all gone through, at the same time doing what it takes to restore what has been taken. And so until we get to that point, until we actually do that work, then it's going to be very, very difficult to have racial healing in this country.
Thank you so much, Cameron. I'd like to move to Devin, and then after Devin, if any of our other panelists would like to chime in and answer that question, please feel free. So Devin, take it away.
Thank you, Brother Cameron. That was an amazing response. I echo a lot of what Cameron said. I think, racial healing is accountability, and it's honesty, and it's speaking truth to power. And it's also a full stop on the current harm. Everyone wants to talk about immediately after the Capitol insurrection attack that we needed to get to healing. But the fact of the matter is y'all are talking about healing and nobody's been put in handcuffs. Nobody's been held responsible. Nobody's been held accountable. And we know, as being a frontline Black Lives Matter movement for Black Lives activist, I know that I was met with a different level of force at every time that I have spoken up about racial injustice in this country, along with my comrades and hundreds of thousands of other protesters, have been met with tanks, rubber bullets, tear gas, riot gear, dogs, all of the things. And so, to see what happened at the Capitol and then immediately to hear some political figures on the right and the left talk about the need to move to healing felt like the most tone-deaf response imaginable. In addition to that, I think it is also about reparations. But before we get to the reparations, can we stop the harm that we're currently doing? For example, Georgia spends $1.8 billion on police, prisons, and jails in this state. That is directly related to a racial justice issue. And how can we suppose to heal the harm caused to people in this country who are Black and represent other racial groups when we continue to spend billions of dollars dedicated towards their oppression, when we continue in this city to collude with corporate interests over the interest of community, when we continue to push out residents who have been here for eons. And we pushed them out from being able to have affordable housing here. How can we have racial healing? How can we have racial healing when I live in Bankhead, which is about 10 minutes away from Buckhead, and my life expectancy is about 63 and a half in comparison to Buckhead, where the life expectancy is almost 90. And that is because the lack of grocery stores, that is because of the lack of healthcare access, that is literally because we allow chemical plants and industrial waste sites to be built in Black communities. So we continue to move forward with harm, but we want to talk about healing, and the two just don't compute. And so in order for us to actually start the process of healing, we must identify how we are harming all of the people who are oppressed in this country and immediately do a full stop on the harm.
Absolutely. Thank you, Devin. Dr. Cohen.
Thanks. I should start by admitting I'm unsure what racial healing is or what it would consist in, because I think reasonable people disagree about this. It's controversial, but I think, even well-intentioned people might think of it slightly differently. From my own view, I think that, well, what this would be is something that people have to figure out as they move along. They have to think about their communities. They have to think about the past and especially their futures. I just published a book on apologies and moral repair, and I talked a good bit in there about reparations for historic injustice and what we owe each other. So to start racial healing, I'd say, just as we've been hearing, it's got to include stopping what's going on, stopping the transgressions against rights, especially by the government, and especially in the form of overcriminalization. And one of the unsung barriers that is a really serious impediment for underserved communities to get by, to remove economic barriers that keep these communities from making themselves better. And certainly there's got to be some reckoning with our shared past. The past isn't past. We know that. It stays alive. It's rehearsed on the streets, and it's rehearsed very much every day in our families over the dinner table. And then, mindful of how this has inflected our lives and those of our ancestors, we can be aware of the possibilities for mutual growth, and then we can maybe make some important progress. But that's just an outline. We got to figure out what people can do once the government has stopped a lot of what they're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'd like to start with Stephanie and Alba for this one. All right. So our talk today was loosely inspired by Jeff Chang's recent book, We Gonna Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation, where he examines some of the most contentious issues of race and inequality and looks at how culture impacts our understanding of the politics of this polarized moment. How has your own culture influenced your personal and political lens as it relates to race? And so Stephanie, and then we'll move to Alba.
I think that I think it's informed by sort of challenging what is the sort of model minority myth. I think is part of it. I forgot to say in the beginning, I'm also a transracial adoptee, and I'm also queer and a single mom, whatever, all those things. So for my identity, I grew up with these very racist white people, and I lived in this trailer, and then, they were really abusive. So when I got to leave, and I left at 16, it really helped me a lot, and it was the best decision I ever made. And I think that sort of reference of being able to separate myself, and for me, when people talk about sort of white supremacy and they see it in these different ways, I know it in one specific context of it was intimately in my life, the ways that people, I know what white people say when they're behind closed doors in a way that I think a lot of people of color have not seen really, and were said to me, growing up. And I think, because of that reference, I know how evil people can be, and I also know how good people can be if they really choose a different path. And so I think, for myself, it was really relearning and going back to sort of my cultural roots, which included language, culture, drumming, just a whole bunch of different things. And then also to really be comfortable with the complexity of what it means to be an Asian American identity. I think a lot of times it's only viewed in one particular way. It's sort of like that crazy rich Asian sort of situation, or it's a very sort of like maybe a different historical context, which is also racist, which is like, you know, sort of like an old school Chinese, you know, sort of immigrant. But I think that the reality is the ways that people come into the US, and particularly for me, it's like I had to find my own way, which is an immigrant story. And I think redefining that, I think, is important. And I think before the immigrant narrative was so narrow, and particularly for Asian Americans, that Asian Americans aren't queer, Asian Americans are definitely not single moms, and Asian Americans are not, you know, sort of like outspoken and sort of bold. And I think that changing that, and it's starting to be different as time goes on, but it's really, really important to see more of that, like in either, I don't know, social media culture or in culture overall. It's starting to change, but it's still, you know, emerging.
Thank you, Stephanie. Alba.
Yeah, so for me, I think I have to address like Latinidad, Latin America, and race there. So like Latinidad in general is just a catalyst of white supremacy. Like the concept was created to bunch the whole continent together, and it just erases the struggles of Black, Indigenous, and non-white colonized people who lived in Latin America. It bunches all up, it erases the individual struggles. And I grew up in a Mexican household, immigrant community, but you know, it wasn't until college until I really got to see just the different facets of Latinidad in general and how people use being Latinx to mask their privilege in many ways. Because we'll have white Mexicans, white Colombians, white Puerto Ricans, white people from Latin America who use the term Latin American, I'm Latina, to kind of separate themselves from their position in whiteness. And I think that that's obviously not right. And growing up, because growing up, you're kind of told like you're Mexican, you're Latinx, you're not white. And then going to college and seeing like, oh, like I may not be, but you most certainly are. It's different because like it depends on people, on really just like what is your race, and the concept of Latinidad is just a big kind of, it's just like I said, the catalyst of white supremacy. It erases a bunch of struggles. And not only that, I started to notice that in Latinx spaces, everyone up top was white. It doesn't matter. It could be as minimal as like the president of a club here at Georgia State, or that is Latinx specifically, or as big as like the president of like an institutional countrywide org. They'll 9 times out of 10 they will be white. It's always white people who kind of take the leadership in Latinx struggles and kind of take the mic away from Black, Indigenous, Latino people specifically. And, you know, like kind of going into college, I was like, I don't like this. This isn't right. And kind of realizing like I've come across a lot of people who are white and do not want to admit that, do not want to admit their position that they have in white supremacy. Avoiding that and not facing that just makes you worse. It makes you bad. It makes you just complicit in the violence that's going on against non-white communities, not only in Latin America, but here in the United States too. If you can't even address it to yourself, then what even is the point? And I think that's really like influenced my personal and political lens, because I don't see like we're making the change to see past just ethnicity in Latinx spaces. But I think now personally, it's like I'm very critical when it comes to just specifically non-Black, non-Indigenous people, members of the community who just aren't holding themselves accountable for the violence that's continuously done towards us. And I think, like, personally, I'll continue to try to educate and kind of learn, but there's so much that I can do as an individual that it gets to the point where white people have to step up and kind of just address that they are white in the first place. White Latinos have to kind of realize that they are taking space whenever they speak on our behalf. They are taking space when they put themselves in leadership positions that they have no business being in. If it's a leadership position about social advocacy and social justice, you are taking the mic away from people who have actually experienced social injustice. Sometimes being told hola at the store is not the same as the violence that you get told that non-white people experience in those communities, because that's literally the extent of their oppression most of the time. They'll be like, oh, well, people will say hola to me at the store. That's not what we mean. We mean the literal violence that we're going through from just our faces, from just how we look. And I think that's really radicalized me, because it gets annoying and it gets to the point where even just hearing that, I'm like, I'm so dismissive about it sometimes. And I know, and I think for us to really have and improve our position in the United States specifically, I think we have to kind of address that, and Latinos have to address that for themselves specifically. That's step number one, because a lot of the times they will be Black Lives Matter, they will be I support other marginalized communities, but they don't even identify as white, and that's the first step in a person's radicalization and fight against oppression. Like, how are you going to fight white supremacy and you don't even know you're part of it, kind of type thing. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Did any of our other panelists want to briefly add to this before we move to the third question?
Yeah, that's just a commonality in also being Caribbean, is that you find, particularly in Trinidad, it's one of the most racially diverse countries in the Caribbean. So there's a significant population of Black people, but also folks from Asia, folks from the Middle East, and indigenous people. And it is very interesting that particularly in Jamaica, where there's a large issue around colorism, that you oftentimes see for years, prime ministers were white passing. For years, people who were in government in Jamaica were white passing or white. And we don't talk about how just because you are Jamaican, just because you are Trinidadian, that does not necessarily denote that your national identity aligns with the experiences of most of the people who also call those places home. And so I really appreciate you amplifying that and uplifting that, because it is even the ways in which the Caribbean is oftentimes lumped into Latin America and social studies here in the United States. It robs people from having independent cultural identities that are nuanced, and also blurs the line from where we can hold people accountable for how white supremacy has independently harmed these places in very unique ways. There's a lot of commonality with white supremacy, but there's also a lot of nuance. And I think speaking to how folks sometimes like to, the Rachel Dolezals of the world, who like to admonish themselves from whiteness, while still getting the privileges of being white, is insane to me. It is literally the definition of insanity.
Thank you, Devin. We're going to move on to our next question. So in one of the chapters entitled The In-Betweens on Asian Americanness, Chang talks about Asian Americans and Black solidarity. He states Asian Americans owe so much of their presence in this country to the Black struggle for freedom, from birthright citizenship to the ability to tell our stories in education and the culture to the civil rights we enjoy. What are your thoughts on this statement? And how have other marginalized ethnic communities struggled for freedom in the United States? And I know, Stephanie, we just started with you on the last one. I'd like to start with you on this one too, just to get your perspective.
So I'm not speaking for all Asians, obviously, but I would say that my perspective is I think that there's a lot of truth to that. There's Carol Anderson, who's a professor at Emory. In a couple different of her books, she's talking about the citizenship piece, right? And just even that access and just sort of like where it is, even just fundamental things like the right to vote is like the question of citizenship. And we're coming up against the question of citizenship now, right? Not just in voting, but just in so many different aspects, like who qualifies to be a quote unquote person, right? And then you have the struggles of the immigrant rights communities now, and you have mass incarceration, right, of Black, Brown, and then you also have a smaller group of Asian folks like in detention centers, right, because of debating who is a person, right, and sort of that citizenship piece and like what rights do they have. So I think that that part of it is really true, and I think the sort of newer sort of issues that are coming up now for Asian Americans is this: we are linked now and have always been linked to and blamed upon when an issue happens, like a health issue, like a pandemic situation. Like it was called the Wuhan flu, it was called the China virus and all that stuff. And so it's like, and that was also happening, back with, opium dens and that kind of stuff. So I think, there's a specific way that Asians are viewed, and then they take from the playbook of how they've marginalized and oppressed Black people and applied it still to the same ways in terms of like limiting folks, but their reasoning for it is something because it's foreign. Like we're constantly considered like a perpetual foreigner. And so even that term Asian American is still like a newer concept, because people are like, how come you don't have an accent? How come your English is so good? How come, like, how can you be both or many different things? I think for younger generations, that concept of the intersectional lens is definitely sharper, I think, and people can see it more. I think it's just a lot of people in power aren't ready for that shift in that narrative yet. And so it's up to other folks, folks like us on this panel, really to push it.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'd like to move to Cameron.
I appreciate that, Stephanie. What's fascinating, there is a documentary called The Color of Fear by Lee Moon Hwa that came out in the 1990s. And what it does, it details the experiences of 8 different men, some Caucasian, some Asian, Vietnamese, and also Black African-American. And one of the things that they spend the weekend together talking about why they had so many disagreements in their own communities. Now, historically, sure many of you are aware that there has been some atrocities that have happened between even Black and Asian communities. There's, the shootings in California where there's a 14-year-old Black girl who was shot in the head that led to one of the riots in California. There's been a lot of things that have happened. You can see in the movies, where you can watch stuff like, Menace to Society, and you can kind of see like these play on relationships that exist between Black and Asian or Vietnamese communities. But one of the things that they talked about was the real reason why communities of color, whether it be Asian, Vietnamese, whether it be Black, whether it be Latin, the reason that they have so many issues is because of the conversation surrounding the proximity to whiteness. Because ultimately, the reason that our communities may have difficulties between each other is because in the colonial world, we were taught that the reason that we should not understand each other, should not like each other, should not support each other is because those of us who are most in proximity to whiteness are better than those who are furthest away from it. So the conversations and the cultural disagreements that we've had truly start in the bastion of white supremacy, in the bastion of understanding what whiteness is. There's an author, Duke Divinity, James Cameron Carter. He talks about whiteness as a disease. It's literally a sickness that infects who you are. It's infected Caucasian Americans. It's also infected everyone else as well. The way that we understand each other, it's mostly through how close are you to whiteness? You know, when Alva's even talking about in the Latin experience, you have your white Latins, and you also have your Afro Latins. I mean, completely different experiences in America in particular, and all of it does stem from this idea of whiteness. And so in her quote, it is significant for so many reasons, but one of them is the fact of the matter is that relationships that we are trying to bridge now, moving towards a beloved community, a lot of this is going to be us identifying and conquering the themes of whiteness that exist in our own communities and the conversations and conflicts that exist between other and different people groups. You know, one of the things about the Black freedom struggle that is so important is we have learned how to deal with a perpetual state of suffering, meaning we have had to deal with the fact that we have been enslaved in this country. Then we had Jim Crow. The government has never actually been for us. In every iteration of society, we have had to fight for our humanity and for our identity. So in the same way, the reasons that the Asian communities, like, you know, what happened in World War II with the Japanese internment camps, I mean, things like that, when they were happening, there have been similar experiences that have shaped their own communities that we're able to rally around. So I think that once we realize that the enemy is not between us, the enemy is not between Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latinx Americans. Again, we have different experiences, but they're still valuable. But once we can identify what whiteness has done to us, to cause the conflicts between our community, the conflict that exists when we talk to each other, when we speak to each other, when we don't do business with each other, when we can identify what whiteness has done and how it's infiltrated our society, that's how you continue to move forward. And then that's why Asian community can latch on to the Black freedom struggle, because we have done the work, we have laid the foundation, and we want to help you continue to move forward as a community. And so a part of this is just understanding what divides us is the same thing that has been what we have been experiencing and dealing with for so many years and centuries, which again is whiteness and white supremacy. So I think the conversation we can have around that will help in moving forward and bridging that gap and becoming that beloved community that we want to become. So, I mean, I thought that her quote was spectacular.
Thank you. Thank you. Panelists, just as a FYI, we have about 24 minutes left. And so I am going to move on to our next question. And anyone can chime in. Dr. Cohen, if you want to start with this one, and then we'll move to Devin. Actually, let's give some structure and order. So my next question is, we have countless examples, both historically and currently, of the suffering that Black and Brown folks have experienced at the hands of white supremacy. What are some more recent events that are direct examples of how prevalent white supremacy still is in this nation today?
Hey, thanks. This is a really important question, and I should once again preface, I'm not a social scientist, but the sorts of events I would talk about would be structural features, and the ones that pop to mind instantly are barriers to entry in the marketplace. They keep people on their own and with communities from opportunities to advance themselves and their families. And some of the examples that I think of, and some of them are more controversial than others, licensure laws, minimum wage legislation, various housing regulations that make it systematically harder for less skilled persons to build up the experience, the social and economic capital to flourish. And these systematically disadvantage persons of color, and they make it harder for them to start businesses, to enter a trade, and to have accessible housing that allows them to build up the equity that they can pass on as well to future generations. So those, I think, are really important and often understated as part of the challenges that the state is imposing on underserved communities.
Thank you for that. I think also to kind of tie into the last question a little bit is white supremacy is illustrated in the misteaching of America. So many people come to this country, you know, even folks who are Black, who are immigrants that come to this country who have a disrespect for people from the Black diaspora that are here in the Americas. Make no mistake about it. Any person who is a person of color that is sitting in a class at Georgia State, it's because a Black person got beat up, got disrespected, spit on, disavowed, and all of the things that are harmful so that you could sit in that seat. And I think when we are uncomfortable naming that, that is a direct reflection of white supremacy. In addition to that, when we talk about beyond the white supremacy was illustrated not just in the attack at the Capitol, but it was illustrated in the I guess the word that I'm looking for is the self-righteousness, the ability to move in a way in a mob and feel as though that you did is a direct reflection of white supremacy. And so oftentimes we are living in two different Americas, because at the same time, I thought that it was one of the protesters actually was charged with trying to sell material to Russia. And that is treason. That is treason. And the idea that you can have all the rights and all the freedoms, yet still march into the Capitol angry, was also made that moment kind of laughable. It's like, well, you got all the freedoms, all the right, all the access to wealth, all the land right uses, all of it, all of the things. And you somehow are coming in here angry and upset as if you are being oppressed. And I'm just like, where are you? We are truly living in two different Americas. And it is because of the misteaching of history in this country, that white people don't understand that their whiteness gives them privileges and access that they don't deserve. And instead of being so focused on that being an attack on your character, it is an opportunity and an invitation to move in a different way and reimagine how we are in relationship with one another, and to move in a different way and move towards accountability. But oftentimes we are taught to get too caught up on white tears. We get too caught up on white feelings being hurt about the truth. And so I think to kind of bring it back full circle, white supremacy is the denial of the truth. After we saw the historic wildfires in Australia, I think that was last year, it was so crazy because one of the reporters was reporting in the middle of the day, the sky was orange, and I was like, is she reporting from hell? Where is this? And someone said, one of the people who were commenting was saying that in order for the world to be saved, the white man must deny himself. That it was actually an Australian proverb that came from Aborigines who are also, melanated people who were, essentially killed off by white folks in Australia. And I think that is a powerful quote. And it is something that we have to ask ourselves: are white people willing to deny themselves for the collective good of humanity? And that is a question that we haven't had an answer to yet.
Thank you, Devin. I would like to move on to the next question, and I'd like to start with Alba. So, as the nation continues to grapple with issues of race and racism, how do we build more inclusive communities and bridges across racial divides?
So I think the key to this is just providing a larger platform for Black people specifically. I think inclusivity shouldn't be the focus of our journey to racial equality, just because, as we were talking about before, the key for to get to racial equality is Black liberation, is the fight for abolition, and so I think that to build and to bridge different racial divides, it's the key will always be Black liberation, giving the mic to Black people and showing solidarity, especially during this time, and not just showing solidarity, but acting on it. And whether that means going to protests, donating to mutual funds, mutual aid funds, and you just can't ignore, you can't bridge across racial divides by ignoring Black voices. You can't not, especially MLK Day was yesterday, and we saw people who actively are enabling white supremacy every single day just stop in their tracks and post an MLK quote. And that's just an example of how it just goes over their head sometimes, the actual fight for liberation and what we need to do. We talk about, unity, and we talk about inclusivity, but I think that if we're ever going to get to that point, which I really hope we do, we have to put Black people in the fight, in the forefront. as Devin said, like I'm a student at Georgia State University because of the fight a Black person did, Black people, Black community did during this community. And I can't just sit here and ignore that and just say like, oh, well, we should listen to everybody and every voice, which we should, but we should also put an emphasis that Black voices are the key to all of our liberations.
Thank you, Alba. And any of our other panelists, feel free to chime in and answer this question.
That's the quote of the day. Black people are key to all of our liberation. Like that is the quote of the day. That is the quote of the month. That should be the quote for 2021. Everybody should be moving everything that we do in all spaces: business, commerce, trade, politics, health, human services, education, the academy, science, technology. That our liberation is tied up in the liberation of Black people. And that we cannot move forward if Black people are not put to the front to collectively move us to where we need to as a human race. Because beyond, race is a relatively new concept in the experience of humanity. And so, we are either going to find progress together or we are going to hang together. White people have to understand that their white supremacy will lead to their demise as well. And it won't be because of the hands of someone Black, it'll be because of your own hands. And so recognizing this, I think a lot of times there are white folks who are waiting for this gotcha moment, who are waiting for Black people to finally say, oh, we're going to invoke revenge. That's just not even how we're built. We're not built like that. If we wanted to revoke revenge, you don't think we would have done that already? We want to be in community and be living in peace just like everyone else. But peace cannot come at the expense of us. Peace cannot come with continued oppression. That is not peace.
Thank you, Devin. Panelists, we have 3 more questions that I would like for us to get through that I think are really great questions. I'm going to start with Stephanie on the next one, and then if anyone's moved or feels the need to answer, please do. What is anti-racism? And for those who are looking to learn or do anti-racist work, what advice would you give them?
I think that there's been sort of a weird professionalism about anti-racism stuff that I think has kind of like lost the focus or the point. And I think that that's kind of enabled people to sort of like wash their hands of it without any real accountability. I would say like one example of something where it's about keeping your community accountable or collecting your people is like so we work in Gwinnett, which is the most sort of diverse county, right? And the when folks wanted to have a couple protests, Black Lives Matter protests in Gwinnett, a lot of people there were I think they were confused why it needs to happen in Gwinnett. Why wouldn't it just happen in downtown, etc. And so it was like hard for us to. The community was like having a hard time understanding it, and so we had some of the organizers go on Korean radio and Vietnamese radio and Chinese radio to talk about why, from their own perspective, and we translated for them their own perspective about why they felt like it was really important. And that changed the whole like sort of dynamic about it, because there was so much like sort of BS like rumors and speculation about what it was and what it wasn't. And I think it really changed things having that happen. There was a Korean chamber association that wanted to boycott it. There's this one guy, Andy Kim, I'll name him, Andy Kim, and he really wanted to boycott it. He tried to get signatures of all these people. And, after all of the coverage that had happened, because we had people on all the radio stations, like they just stopped. They completely stopped, and then decided like for them to save face, they better actually come. And so then they were giving out masks and PPE and all this kind of stuff. that's token, that's like the quintessential token diversity training, right? Is like an epitome, is like the story of it is that, right? Did this person learn anything? Was there real accountability? Was there real understanding? No, right? They're trying to save face because they're now shamed into it. That's not enough, right? So we constantly started to have more dialogues with some of the business owners about, sort of having more dialogues with their Black business owner neighbors. And that actually made a bigger impact and a more longer term impact than just having a thing where they went from boycotting something to actually, giving out free PPE and stuff like that too. So that sort of change has to be where people are learning in real time, I think, is the thing that I see as the most powerful versus it being a situation where they're like in a training. It just doesn't really do it. That's my thought.
Thank you. Cameron, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, sure. Essentially, it's anti-racism. The work of it is decentralizing yourself from the story, deconstructing your own biases and institutional practices that are at the heart of them anti-Black, but also anything that you do, any practice that you have that is perpetuating the violence and harm done to other people based on that racial hierarchy, on that racial structure, is the work of anti-racism. That is both a personal, corporate, and collective work to identify anything in your practice individually and systemically that is anti-Black, and doing what you can to fix that and rebuild it in a way that honors all peoples, and especially Black folks and brown folks.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Last two questions. Do you agree with Kendrick Lamar, hip hop artist and poet, when he said, "We're going to be all right"? Is racial healing truly possible? I want to move from Devin to Dr. Cohen and then Alva.
It's not a matter of whether if it is possible, it has to be possible, because we will cease to exist if we don't get this together. I think we are at, I do believe that it's possible also, because this is what we saw at the US Capitol was a temper tantrum that white supremacy is throwing, because it knows that its time is up. And so we are going to move through a period of time where we will see, unfortunately, I do predict that we will see some more white supremacist extremist attacks. But I also know that we will get through this short period so that we can get to a longer period where we are truly in peace. And so I do believe that we will be all right, because we have to be all right. We have no other choice. And I intend, to die an old man, to have children who will be able to move past the harms of today, and have grandchildren that will be able to do the same. And so that is why I do the work that I do daily at the Black Futurist Group, to dismantle the criminal legal system and reimagine public safety, and to ensure that we have health and wellness that is centered around the needs of the most marginalized and the most oppressed, because it's future building work. And so a part of that future building work, and a part of, we can't move forward these very elaborate public policy positions and the things that the different candidates are championing, like John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, if we are not able to move to racial reconciliation and healing. It's just pieces of words on paper. And so we can do a lot of things, but we got to get in each other's face. We got to talk it out. We got to be vulnerable. We got to be upset, and we got to be committed to shared and principled struggle. Because as the slavery abolitionist Frederick Douglass once stated, those who profess to favor freedom yet to appreciate agitation are those who want the crops without the plowing up of the ground. They want the rain without the thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. We must be willing to agitate, and love on each other while we do it as well.
Thank you, Devin. Dr. Cohen.
Thanks. This is a hard question about racial healing and whether it's possible. And I'm going to agree with a lot of what Devin said, but maybe begin to ask about some of the other parts. Is it possible? I guess I would say it depends. It depends on the person. It depends on the community. And I think we have to be honest and admit it might not be possible for some persons. Maybe other people, they might be in more fortunate circumstances where they can be part of generations and communities where they can grow and they can learn from history. But in some cases, it's not. I mean, we can think about cases of people who have just very deep grievances about injustices that they personally experienced and that were visited upon their communities. And they did not have the space to forgive and to get past that. Jean Amélie is a really good example of somebody who was a Holocaust survivor, and he never got over it, as it were. And there's room for us to say, yeah, we can sort of understand how you can carry that with you and not allow that to just be put into the past. So maybe we can set our sights more modestly and set them lower. And instead of asking about racial healing, we could ask about peace. Is peace possible? Is prosperity possible? And then maybe we can think about, all right, what are the social and economic conditions that make it possible for people to grow and to flourish in peace? And I don't know what that is. I mean, having conversations like this and having people honestly approach the humanities and the social sciences and think about what we can learn from history and what we can learn about the people who've come before us. Those seem to be really important preconditions.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Alva?
So yeah, I agree with Devin completely. Like, yes, we're gonna be all right. We have to be all right. Pessimism, like, is the tool for white folk, and we can't afford to not be optimists about racial equality, racial healing. We can't let white people, white supremacy kind of hold us any longer, and we can't let ourselves think that we're not going to be all right, because we have to be. And I refuse to let white supremacy have a hold on me and tell me that I'm never going to be all right and that I'm never going to reach a state where, yeah, I may not ever be like completely racially healed, I don't know, but it's the fight toward it, and it's making sure that we're optimistic about it, because, you know, pessimism is the tool that white people use against us, and we can't let that take control over us.
Thank you, Alba. And our final question, panelists, and anyone can answer. I would actually like for all of us to give just a brief answer as we close out. For those who are currently processing racial trauma and may not have the tools or emotional capacity, what can you share to help process said trauma? We'll start with Stephanie, we'll move to Alba, Dr. Cohen, Devin, and we'll close with Cameron.
I think it's really important to give yourself some time. You know, a lot of things happened in the election that we just had that were that was ridiculous and actually very violent. And I haven't personally had enough time to sort of process it either. And so I think the attacks are still going to continue, and they're already continuing. With a lot of Black women leaders that are sort of getting investigated right now with the Secretary of State. Like, it's just a tool, you know, of the way that you can legally, you know, use white supremacy in your favor, right? So I think for processing, it's allowing time and allowing some space to really process it out with trusted people. And I think it's not, and if you allow the time and you allow the sort of space for it, I think that actually puts people in a different place. And I think a lot of times people just don't give themselves enough time.
Thank you. I believe it was Alba, then Dr. Cohen.
Yeah, so like, I don't know if I'm qualified to really give tools, like therapeutic tools type But something that works for me is like I like having open conversations with my friends and my partner that about issues and everything that I kind of have to unpack. Like speaking and being very vocal and venting about it, whether it be through social media or just in person, really helps me when it comes to processing trauma. I don't necessarily like seek guidance from my friends. I don't seek stuff like that because you need to go to a therapist for that sometimes. And you know, mental health is a really, really big thing in our communities that I think has to be addressed. And but sometimes venting and unpacking just really helps a lot, and kind of being patient with yourself and knowing that that trauma will, yeah, like it'll affect you, but it's important not to let it take take over your life, um, and kind of just being in a certain emotional state that doesn't prevent you from being the person that you're meant to be. And it's a lot to put on. A lot of people of color do have to face this trauma, and with the seizing of the Capitol and everything that's just been happening recently, it's really hard to kind of um, have open conversations when it kind of almost everyone is experiencing it. It's like, how do two people processing trauma kind of speak to each other and unpack it? But it can help, and I think that is something that helps for me. It's just venting, being very, and also being there for my friends, and being there for my for even just random acquaintances, just being there and serving as a support line. Because sometimes, especially like for Black people in America, like this is just like getting ridiculous. And it's to the point where we have, me as a non-Black person, I have to show my help. I have to offer help in the best ways that I can. Um, and
Thank you, Alva. Greatly appreciated. And our final three, Dr. Cohen, Devin, and Cameron.
Thanks. This is, I'm with Alba on this. This strikes me as a big question about recovery from trauma that I don't have a real expertise in that. There are many approaches, as I understand it, and some involve cognitive therapies and some exposure therapies. But again, we have to admit, sometimes people don't heal, but we want to set up the social and political conditions that make it possible for us to live in peace and prosperity. So among the things that people might do is learn from others, see what people have done and how they've overcome the challenges that they faced. People can read about the experiences of particular persons and particular communities so that we can figure out how people can live in peace and freedom and prosperity.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Devin?
I am also not qualified to tell folks how to address their personal traumas. One thing I will say is that I showed a picture of my ancestor, Paul Bogle. In Movement, we have lots of songs. One of the songs is called Ancestors Watching. And I think it's important to develop a connection with your ancestors. Particularly as Black people and people of color who have been shaped by oppression. And I believe that those connections to my ancestors sustain me in the moments where I'm feeling most pressured by the trauma. Beyond that, what I would say, I think institutions have a responsibility to make spaces and provide resources for people to sort through their trauma. We can't, as universities can't expect for Black students to be functioning at high capacity right now. We need to make space for that. If you are a place of employment, don't give lip service to, oh, we're here for you. Actually be there for them. Make sure that there are services available, that there are times in which people can just I can call into work and say, I'm calling out Black today because it's hard and I need a break. That is radical solidarity in this moment. We don't necessarily have all of the answers, but I think it's about making space and letting people know that there is that you are supportive of the ways in which they sort through their trauma, not just with lip service, but with resources and actually showing up.
Thank you, Devin. And lastly, Cameron.
Dev, I'm gonna give Dr. King a call today, and I'm gonna tell her I'm calling out Black just because you said that. You know, one of the things that I think is important to all of this, y'all, is giving yourself space to grieve. You know, post-traumatic slave syndrome is becoming more widely accepted in a lot of circles, academic circles, and that's a very real thing. Racial trauma is one of the greatest traumas that we experience in America. So please give yourself space. If you need to see authentic counseling, please do so, especially young people or you're a student. Make sure you're taking advantage of those opportunities that you have on campus. Give yourself permission to share at the level and at the rate that you feel you need to share, whatever it is, however you need to communicate it. Make sure you take that time to specialize in making sure you are prioritized when it comes to your emotional health and your mental health and your spiritual health as well. Then the last thing is put your emotions to work. Once you've gone through that process, once you are activated, put those emotions to work, because those are the emotions that help you to fight through the process of building that beloved community and doing the work in a way. Again, Dr. King, nonviolent strategy, strategic action, information gathering, following the principles and steps of nonviolence. Put it to work, because again, go through your problem and give yourself that space. Make sure you're utilizing it and putting it to work as well.
Thank you, Cameron. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists today for taking time out of your busy schedule to have this very important conversation as we recognize the 5th National Day of Healing. If you saw in the chat, you all, I know this last question talked about processing trauma. We have an amazing counseling and testing center at Georgia State University that's available for students, faculty, and staff. If you have never visited their department before or experienced any of their services, please do. If you ever need to process anything traumatic as it relates to race or anything just in general, please visit our counseling and testing center. They have an amazing staff, and it's just an amazing good time. All right, so without further ado, I also want to thank Trio for co-sponsoring this event with us. Cedric, if you're still on, shout out to Cedric, who leads the Trio program as well. And so without further ado, thank you all so much. And you all have a great rest of your Tuesday.